switch to English since we are going to start our conference. I'm pleased to welcome Simon Saradzhyan once again for discussing a very timely topic, I guess, because we have to explore the complexity of the Russia-China relations. And when I'm saying this, I have in mind the recent events in early June when, there was these commemorations for D-Day, and Putin was not invited, and he gave some speech where he tried to maybe downplay the importance of D-Day in the general outcome of the Second World War. And in parallel, he welcomed very warmly President Xi Jinping in St. Petersburg at the Economic Forum. The Chinese delegation was the largest of all the delegations that were there. They signed a new declaration on global partnership and cooperation. So I think it's really a good time for us to welcome Simon Saradzhyan to discuss this topic and the implications of this rapprochement, which is more and more solid in my view. And so it's the second time we welcome you here. You are the founding director of the Russia Matters project. You have some copies of one of the publications of this project. I strongly advise you to check this project, to use it, because it's very critical and very complex on everything that is Russian. So I think you should definitely visit this website and use this project in your research. And so thank you for coming here for the second time. We are very happy to have you here again, and the floor is yours now for roughly 30 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session. So Simon, if you want to.
Merci. Je m'appelle Simon Saradzhyan. Je travaille at Harvard University. I'm sorry, that's all I managed to learn after 40 days of practicing French on Duolingo. But I was born in Paris, actually, which is a village in Karabakh where they don't speak French, but where there is as hot as here. So I feel at home. The topic of my presentation today is, will Russia and China enter an alliance? To be more precise, I should have probably said, will Russia enter alliance with China? Because my focus has been Russia for many years, and I continue to take keen interest in developments of this country, which I think matters positively and negatively. But here I'm speaking in my personal capacity, although we do at Russia Matters follow the subject of Russian-Chinese relations closely, if only because some of the Western analysts have described the hypothetical alliance between the two countries as a nightmare, or even worse nightmare. So that's clearly a subject that is on my minds of many people, including policymakers and policy researchers. So if you look at recent developments, you would notice that in the military domain, the two countries have been drawn increasingly closer to each other. You see military political leadership exchange visits. Xi's visit was almost 30th time he and Putin had met in Moscow and then St. Petersburg. Below the level of political leadership, there's high-level consultations going on between Russian and Chinese commanders. And of course, if you look at the actual at the actions of the two militaries, you will notice things that are quite new and surprising for some, which is that the Chinese Navy has sent ships to train with Russian Navy, of all places in the Mediterranean, and then in the Baltics. And then on top of it, Russia participates in exercise in South China Sea, where they, according to some reports, practice island seizing. So all of this, and some joint research and development, such as rocket engines. Although I should note, Russia does much more with India than China in that aspect. And then having the Russian Academy of General Staff send lecturers to China and the other way around, all sort of beg the question: is this already a de facto alliance between the two countries? And you can consult the hard copies of this sort of a background that we prepared, and you'll see a divergence of views. Some of the important thinkers on the Russian side, such as Sergei Karaganov, who used to be an advisor to the Security Council, and who has the ear of some policy influentials in the Kremlin, definitely, has described that as a de facto alliance. And so has Kashin, who, like Karaganov, works at the High School of Economics as a lecturer. He has said that the anti-color revolution alliance between Russia and China has been formalized. Not everyone agrees. General Buzhinsky, who used to head the relevant department at the Defense Ministry, Military Cooperation Department, said he'd like to see that alliance, but it's not there yet. And Yang Xintong of Tsinghua University, who attended a conference together with Buzhinsky and others in Moscow of Russian and Chinese policy influentials, also spoke in favor of such an alliance, asking the Russian reporter, "I don't understand, can you explain me why Russia has so far not asked China to form an alliance?" He then refined his view in a Foreign Affairs article, saying the formal alliances are things of the past. This era of bipolar sort of competition between China and US will be featuring mostly ad hoc alliances. But anyway, he spoke in favor, and he's one of the most prominent Chinese thinkers on issues of alliances and national interest and national power. And then, some are skeptical, and I sort of, not to shoot myself in the foot, belong to that school of thought. Bobo Lo, who works here in France now, who has been researching Russian-Chinese relations for a long time, wrote a piece with Fiona Hill saying this is not going to be happening. Sergei Ivanov, who is Putin's close confidant, when he was chief of staff of Vladimir Putin in 2014, he says he doesn't see a need for such an alliance. And on the Chinese side, again, the chairwoman of the Assembly's International Affairs Committee spoke out saying, no, Russia and China are not entering an alliance. So how else do you describe it? Some call it partnership. In fact, documents on both sides describe the relationship as a partnership. But if you read the language, the Chinese side describes it as strategic comprehensive partnership of cooperation. The Russian side says comprehensive partnership and strategic interaction. And the President Xi and President Putin, when they spoke in Moscow and in St. Petersburg in June, you would notice that difference. And the same goes, by the way, for Shoigu and his Chinese counterpart, the defense minister. They also differ a bit in how they describe the relationship. And the reason why Russia is reluctant to add that word, perhaps, is because that is something reserved for India. So the relationship between... Sorry, I accidentally pushed something. So the relationship between Russia and India, Russia describes in its foreign policy doctrine as strategic partnership, but with China is comprehensive partnership. And these words sort of send signals. If you look at India, Russia jointly develops missiles with India. Russia leases atomic submarines to India, which it doesn't do for China. Okay, so I'm not going to bore you perhaps with some of the theory of the subject, but if you look at leading thinkers about alliances like Liska, Morgenthau, Steve Walt, and others, and I can't list them all. Basically, there's certain variety of views. How do you describe an alliance? Is it a formal association or informal? Does it have to include military cooperation and mutual aid in case of aggression and non-aggression against each other or not? But majority, though, would say basically it doesn't have to be formal, but there has to be credible commitment that if I am attacked, you come to my aid, and vice versa, and non-aggression. So that's the view that is, I'd say, from my research, dominant. In terms of alliances, types of alliances, I've listed some here. This is not a comprehensive list. But the one I found perhaps most useful for description of this dyad of Russia and China is Steve Walt's. Steve Walt roots his understanding of alliances in what he calls theory of balance of threat, and he distinguishes two types of alliances. One is alignment, where roughly equal sides align to balance a third country's threat. And the other one is bandwagoning, which is when a lesser power allies with a greater power which is threatening that lesser power, precisely for the purpose of preventing aggression. So, as I said, his is a balance of threat theory. The other one is, of course, much more much better known, the balance of power theory, which I'm sure you all know. And, in my view, if you look at the relationship in the post-Cold War period, I should say, the notion that nations align just to balance another country, just because it has more power, does not quite hold water in all instances. If that was the case, Russia would have allied with China back in the 90s when US was at the peak of its unipolar moment. It was the most powerful state in all senses of that word, with the exception of demography, but militarily, economically. But that didn't happen. Why? Because US was not a threat to Russia. Russia did not perceive US as a threat at the time. Moreover, Vladimir Putin was asking Bill Clinton and Lord Robertson until the end of 2001, I think, so when are you going to invite us into NATO? And, he asked it twice, so it's not an accident. It's not a joke. So at that time, Russia saw itself as part of that, Western alignment of countries, if you will, or moving in that direction. So apart from the idea that threats make nations ally with each other, there's also discussion of how other national interests. So, it's a vital interest to prevent such threats to your statehood as, loss of territory or, conquest or externally induced regime change, right? But there are other interests that nations can take into account, and we'll discuss them briefly when deciding whether to ally or not. And some, like Snyder, says maybe values matter, and even culture. So, we ally because we are both democracies, and that's the underlying reason, in his view, could be the underlying reason. I sort of disagree with that. I think values do not lead to lasting alliances. I'm more of a sort of a realist, if you will, school, look at national interest. But anyway, based on what Walt says, this is my definition of alliance I'm not trying to invent anything here. It's just a synthesis of what Walt has said and Liska has said about alliances. So, first of all, Doesn't have to be formal, but they have to commit to non-aggression against each other, and then they have to commit, if there's an aggression by a third country, that they will come to each other's aid. Sort of a Article 5 kind of a definition. So, based on that literature, I think that when we look at the case of Russia and China, we should foremostly focus on whether there's a threat. Okay? So, just changing power does not entail an alliance. But if a nation like Russia or China see a threat, and if that threat comes from the same source, then chances are greater that they will ally. Okay? But of course, each decision has its own costs. So costs, and this is again rooted in realism per Liska and Walt, costs have to be lower than the benefits. Okay? So there are cases where nations would like, it is in their national interest to enter an alliance, but the external costs become sort of almost prohibitive. I mean, take a look at Georgia and Ukraine. In theory, these countries would have benefited from being members of NATO, but what was the cost so far? Okay, so nations need to keep in mind whether, even if it's in their interest, national interest, to align with someone, whether they will then encounter costs, which could be external and internal in some cases. There could be like a domestic conflict that could outweigh the benefits of such an alliance. So it is, and that's the third point, the net reduction in threat. So if nations think that when they ally together, that would reduce the threat, which would net threat, meaning benefits would be higher than costs, then they are more likely to align. Okay, so I'm not going to bother you with the further discussion. This is perhaps a subject for a more, a different kind of setting. But if we were to use that definition and look at the relationship, can we, in spite of all the military-to-military cooperation and all the great words that President Putin says about China and President Xi says about Russia, can we describe that as an alliance? I think the answer is obvious, no. I mean, Steve Walt, as an example of an alliance that is not codified in some kind of a grand treaty, cites the example of Israel and U.S. It goes without saying that Israel is confident that U.S. will come to its aid, and U.S. is confident that Israel will help U.S. in military and security ways if needed. Can we, and of course it goes without saying that both countries know that neither is going to commit an act of aggression. We can be pretty sure at the moment that Russia and China are not going to engage in aggression against each other. But can we be sure that either Russia or China will come to the other side's aid if there's a conflict? I'm not sure. I mean, there's no strong indication that is the case. So therefore, I don't think the two countries are in the alliance, no matter though what some officials, former officials, have said. One official I haven't cited is a former senior national security official from Russia. So this former official told my mentor Graham Allison that China and Russia are already in a functional military alliances. I disagree. I mean, unless you define alliances like we train together and develop weapons together, but pretty much, you're on your own. If there's an aggression, well then, yes, this kind of a loosely defined alliance is there. But if you look at things that matter, which is, will you come to my aid? I don't think it's there. So why have Russia and China not entered an alliance so far? So I already described one and which I think is the primary driver, which is the absence of a threat that either country cannot deter on its own. So if you look at Russia's military capabilities and China's military capabilities, and I think I have a slide for that somewhere. You would see that, China, with its minimal deterrence, has 300 deployed warheads. Russia has plenty. So, if worse comes to worse, and conventional deterrence doesn't work, which, by the way, Russia and China are actively developing, and it's in the Russian military doctrine, non-nuclear deterrence, безъядерное сдерживание, then they could use warheads and deter aggression. And, if you look at their capability to sort of finance stability within the country, there's a big difference, of course, between China and Russia. Russia's reserves are 500, plus I haven't counted the rainy day fund. And China's capability is enormous. Okay, so if we were to imagine a situation in which the government cannot any longer fulfill the contract and therefore becomes vulnerable to external pressure on, political changes or changes in the domestic order, both Russia and China have a comfortable cushion. I'm going to skip this part too. These are all again indicators that show that the countries have really good relations, even though they're short of alliance. And you see that compared to U.S., EU, Russians think highly of the Chinese. Although you could see that with EU, the situation is changing. So Russians' view of EU is improving. Okay, so the primary reason, as I said, both countries can deter military and security threats on their own. Okay. But what are the other reasons? And the other reason, I think, is that there's certain tangible difference between how Russia impacts, in ways that Russia impacts Chinese vital national interests, and the way, and the other way around. And this is partially rooted in the growing disparities, economic disparities. Demographic disparities are not growing, but they're enormous. And I think going forward, some of these disparities can deepen, which would make Russian leadership, among other things, even more cautious when it comes to aligning with China. Because Russia, if you look at its foreign policy doctrine, says it wants to play the role of the balancer in on the international scene. So Russia, it is in its DNA that it cannot be a junior partner in a relationship. And Chinese have joked that, well, maybe the elder sister would be a way Russia could agree to be named in that relationship. But Russians don't understand that kind of humor. So if we were to look at the impact, China's impact on Russia's vital interests, the way I see those, you'd see that, mostly presently is positive or not significant. Prevention of armed aggression against Russia. Of course, that China by the virtue of forging close military ties, is no longer a threat by itself, and the two countries have, formalized the border, is a positive development. Plus, it means that it won't be used as a springboard if, in some kind of a worst-case scenario, which Russian generals might imagine, the threat comes from other countries that use China as a springboard. So that's a positive. On secession of territories from Russia, the overall impact is insignificant. I mean, yes, there are Uyghurs that come from China and fight in the North Caucasus, but they number, in low dozens, I think, overall years. So not a great impact. Now, when it comes to, of course, productive relationship with key global players, China has a distinctly positive impact because it's one. And so it does on, preservation of viability and stability of major markets for Russian goods and services. And finally, when you look at Russia's interest in being surrounded with friendly states amongst which it can thrive, it's again a positive impact. But if you look in future, it's not so clear. Because, for instance, the far east of Russia has the Urals and Siberia, considered 3 federal districts. Now, the population of these districts is, and that's like 27 regions of Russia, is smaller than just one of the 4 provinces of China that borders Russia. So there's enormous difference in population density. And of course it's Russian officials, including chief of the Federal Border Guard Service in the 90s, have explicitly said that we are worried about this. And this is one of the reasons why, we think about the Far East. So if that trend continues, which is, depopulation in Russia has resumed, and Chinese density remains high, then, as they say, nature does not tolerate vacuum. So I think demography is also in that kind of a sphere. So who knows what could happen? So it's not clear whether the Russian state would benefit from closer relationship with a country that has so many people, and some of whom come and work in Russia, although the number is under 1 million, but can grow. So unclear whether positive, and so on and so forth. If we look at particular interest, as I described, trade, you could see how China is becoming increasingly important for Russia. So that interest, I think, in future will remain. So you see how China took off. 10 years difference. You have Germany as number 1, not anymore. Okay, so that also explains Russia's pivot to China, and that's been going on long before Ukraine. Some keep saying that, it's the Ukraine crisis that antagonized Russia so much that it looked east. No, this has been going on for years, and the main driver is economy. Again, another way to look at the same dynamics. And here's by countries. You see that EU's share is decreasing and Asia Pacific is rising, and even CIS is decreasing. So if you look at the Chinese side, you would see that yes, overall positive, but how significant? And this is the list of interests I derived from Professor Yan's book, an very interesting book where he reviews Chinese vital interests, but also some work we've done with my colleague Ali Wine in the past. So when it comes to preservation of territorial integrity, Russia's taking of Crimea, of course, has worried China in a way. But on the other hand, Russia supports China's territorial integrity, and Russia supports China's stance on Taiwan. But when it comes to disputes in the sea, you would note that Russia actually sells advanced weapons to countries that have territorial disputes with China. So this is a classic Russian policy in that sense, arms trade. So positive, but who knows what will happen next, and there's some negative sides too. So another interest is the experience of direct military threat to China and the strengthening of its national power. Well, positive, because Russia, after a period of hesitation, began to sell most advanced weapons to China, like S-400. True, Russia is developing S-500, but I think China was the first buyer. Sukhoi multi-role warfighters. Russia was really disappointed when China reverse engineered Su-27s. But, this is all in the past, and, Russia is actively contributing to the Chinese, to the strengthening of the Chinese military, and therefore reducing a direct military threat to China. Although, as I said, not all advanced systems are being sold to China, but China remains, I think, in top 3 to date of buyers of Russian weapons. So one sort of a interest where there's somewhat negative impact is the relationship with America. So Professor Yan thinks China should avoid confrontation with America, which I think makes perfect sense. But, if you move closer in a relationship with a country that is in sort of a semi-confrontational relationship, which is Russia, then it sort of impacts your relations with America too. Finally, of course, like Russia, China has a vital interest in developing its economy. And here Russia's input is positive, but not very significant. And recall how China became number one in terms of trade with Russia. Well, here's how China's top trading partners look like. 2008, Russia, right, top 10. 2018, Russia is not even in the top 10 anymore. So number 1, number 11. So this inequality is something that continues to be a recurrent feature of the relationship and the impact that the two countries have on vital interests. And as Dmitry Trenin has observed, for the first time in centuries, China is developing more rapidly than Russia. And for Russia, it's an unusual situation, but as I said, these disparities are there. And look at the GDP of the original domestic product of the 20 plus provinces that make up Urals, Siberian, and Far Eastern Federal Districts. They are like 1/3 of what 4 provinces of China produce. Demographic we discussed. I think, So 100,000 more people live in just one province than in the entire Far East, Urals, and Siberia. So this is not a relationship of equals. We've also done some calculations of, national power. The basic model is share of country's GDP, purchasing power parity, in world's GDP, and note the difference. France, China, US, Russia. So comparable with France, but not with China, definitely. is another method. It's from my modification of the correlates of war way of calculating national power. Basically, again, ratios of countries' share in defense expenditures of the world, countries' share in population of the world, and a couple of more. Again, where's Russia?
In the middle.
Yeah. See, where's China? This is France. And if you were to chart like percent change, or like say this was 1999 was the year when Putin came to power. That's why, in 1999, say value of national power equaled 100. The divergence of trajectories is remarkable. Okay, so there's more of that showing you how Russia lags behind. So, national interest. We discussed an impact. And then another thought that I'm not quite sure about is, does culture matter? I mean, I was asked once, how many examples do you know of country with a completely different culture, embracing an alliance and joining as ally or a long-term ally of a country with a completely different culture. And I cited the example of Japan, but Japan was defeated in World War II and had to sign the unconditional surrender. Russia was not defeated by anyone. So the notion that cultural differences, especially given these unequivocal statements, in spite of all what they say about Russia's future lying in the East, this is Putin and his confidant Ivanov saying that Russia is European. Would that hinder the alliance, emergence of alliance? I think it could. Okay, so I'm not gonna, for purposes of time, summarize my argument, which is threats, ability to deter threats independently, divergence in impact on national interests, and disparities, economic and other disparities in national power, all make conclusion of an alliance in the short-term future unlikely. There's no alliance. What about the longer-term future, 50 years from now? Well, these are the projections by PricewaterhouseCoopers and UN. Okay, so again, China continues its rise in terms of economy, Russia declining, according to PricewaterhouseCoopers. Now, we should treat all this with a pinch of salt. I mean, we can all make all sorts of forecasts. That doesn't mean they all materialize. Demography. This is the UN's has a medium forecast. It has negative, positive, optimistic, pessimistic, and medium. So you see China declining, but still, 16%, more than 16% of population. So still huge disparity between Russia and China. 20% of world's GDP, 2.47% of GDP. Same with population. Okay, so this is just to demonstrate the shares, so it'll be clear. So I think these disparities reduce the likelihood of the alliance in the longer term future. But although they reduce and make it improbable, it's not impossible. So what are the conditions under which the two countries can enter an alliance? And the answer, in my view, is that if both countries feel they can no longer deter a threat on their own by a third country, they would enter an alliance. Per Walt's description, where it's roughly sort of a not so skewed relationship, where they are almost equal in ways they contribute to deterrence. If only one country is unable to deter, then it won't be that kind of alliance. It will be what Steve Walt called bandwagoning. So, which is also possible, which would entail most likely that Russia would have to agree to that role of a de facto junior partner, although the language of the alliance would say something else. So if we were to map out scenarios in which, in this just triad, Russia, China, and US, there'll be over 60 scenarios. And some of them, as I said, see the blue ones, show two countries ally to balance the threat of US. But some can include cases where Russia is threatened, China is not, so Russia seeks to bandwagon with China. So these are not impossible, but they're improbable in my view, given that I think the two countries have sufficient military capabilities in the future to continue to deter other countries, such as the United States. And given that the disparities in the impact of the two countries on vital interests will most likely linger on. Okay, so with that, I think I can conclude so that maybe there'll be more time for questions.
Thank you very much, Simon. Yeah. So we'll take maybe 3 to 4 questions, and short questions, please. And then we get the answers, and maybe we can move on another round.
Well, I highly appreciated your panorama. I would like to change the glasses.
Okay.
Instead of being on China and Russia's side, let's put it in the European side.
Okay.
First of all, there was a guy named Trotsky who said that if you're not interested by war will interest you. Second point concerning the alliance, Dr. Kissinger said, I think it's in the new American foreign policy, that in modern times, the structure of the alliance is that the weak member of the alliance tends to think that whatever he does is protected by the strong one. The last point is that Thomas Schelling divided the nuclear doxa by the deterrence and the compellence. Everyone has a rough deterrence, okay? Even Iran. Now, let's put it this way. China seems to have a kind of compellence, perhaps not all over the world, but in the, comment on dit l'étranger proche, in the near neighborhood. Now, Bernard Posen means and thinks that Putin is the junior partner, in fact. And from a European point of view, and we know that Russia, its main aim is to destroy the European. If you look at the Beria plan, for example, you will always find it. Can we, from our point of view, fear a kind of alliance from Russia and China? And, for example, China didn't condemn very strictly the takeover of Crimea and Ukrainian.
Mm-hmm. It abstained.
Yeah.
Maybe 2 or 3 questions.
Thank you. My question is kind of simple. Russia is moving more and more in Africa, where China got big interest, especially in the Central African region with the Central Republic of Africa. So is it some kind of alliance between Russia and China to have new military interests in Africa, or is a kind of new competition between the two powers, filling the void of the Western politics in Africa? Thank you.
I think Philippe Moreau-Defarge I was a former senior fellow at IFRI. I would like to simplify all your scenarios, which are very complicated, and I'm not sure to have understood what you've said. For me, there is a triangle, the United States, China, and Russia. This triangle is unbalanced. You have two equal partners, the United States and China. Russia is a third partner. But it is not the third partner. China was the third partner in the 70s. It's few. And one of the future. First, concerning an agreement between Russia and China, it will be the same thing as the agreement between Nazi Germany and Stalinist Soviet Union. This is a new Soviet-German pact. It means that the two states are going to agree, but at the end of the day, the struggle will happen between Russia and China. Why? Because of Siberia. We are convinced that all these actors are considered as not moving. In fact, many are going to be destroyed. And we can imagine a division of Siberia between China. I mean, my point my question is, at the end of the day, you must choose a scenario, and I will choose a scenario. You can imagine a war between the United States and China. First scenario, a war between the United States and China. And if there is a war between the United States and China, Russia will have to choose between one of them. Or you have not a war between China and the United States. It means an agreement between the United States and China. And, Russia will be the cocu. Because and sorry, it's not a question, but I would say, what is your favorite scenario? What is your favorite scenario? There is one scenario. I know all scenarios are wrong, but what is your favorite scenario?
Favorite meaning what I would like to happen?
No.
Okay. Can I answer three rather than four? Thank you.
No. What you foresee? No. I don't. You are an analyst. You are not a politician.
No.
The breakup of Russia.
So, in terms of the scenario that I think is most probable is if you look at the next 10 years, there will be no alliance between Russia and China, and relations between Russia and US will remain tense, and relations between China and US will probably become increasingly tense, but there will still be no alliance. And the reason for that is that in the next 10 years, both Russia and China would remain capable to deter military threat, although I doubt that, because we don't know the future of Russian economy, whether Russia would be able to deter other sorts of threats it sees, such as the threat of externally induced regime change. If Russia feels weak in that sense, it would seek to bandwagon with the less threatening power per the balance of theory, per the balance of threat theory. And the less threatening power in that sense would be still China, not US, because China does not seek to mold, in Russia's view, Russia in its own image. Whereas Putin thinks that West wants to turn Russia into a liberal democracy. So that's my prognosis, if you will, for the next 10 years. For Africa, I think, if you were to take my very narrow definition of alliance, which is that, countries agree to non-aggression and come to mutual aid in case of aggression, whatever they do in Africa doesn't quite fit into that definition. What they do, though, especially, not especially, both do, is try to tap the economic potential of Africa, which is forecast to be growing rapidly. And I think, the 10 fastest cities, I might be mistaken, in going forward would be all in Africa. Fastest growing cities will be all in Africa. So Russia anticipates that and tries to position itself to benefit economically. That's the key difference between the relation Russia has with African countries today compared to Cold War, when it was basically bankrolling regimes that would only say, we're socialist. And therefore, out of ideological dogmas, they finance them. This is no longer the case. It's much more profit-oriented exercise. And I don't have information from horse's mouth, but what I read is that, private military companies like Wagner go in, help train, regimes, security forces, help provide security. In exchange, they get cut of the profit of tapping the natural resources they help to protect from threats. And of course, Russia's role in Africa is dwarfed by China's activities. Russia just doesn't have the resources. Both countries see potential of Africa, but there's only as much Russia can invest, whereas China has abundant resources for foreign direct investment, and it sometimes wastes them on projects that are not quite feasible.
Russia invests in North Korea and highly.
Well, I'm not the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia, so I'm not here to defend any country's behavior. If what you say is true, that could violate United Nations Security Council resolutions that Russia has voted for, and it would be regretful.
In the next 10 years, sir,
Yes.
in the next 10 years, what will be the policy, the Chinese policy towards Siberia? What does China want with Siberia?
So, if you look at what common Chinese say when they visit Baikal, they often say, well, the guide has told us, or we know, that this used to be, Chinese land. So, history matters too. Like I said, culture, but history matters too. So, Chinese do not forget that that used to be in their sphere of influence, and they used to populate both banks of the Amur River. And Lee Kuan Yew predicted that one day the Chinese will be populating both banks of the Amur River. But then he said, but first China will have to resolve the issue of Taiwan. So you cannot do multiple things at once. So there's a strategic respite for Russia in that sense. Even if China decides, the leadership decides to do what the tourists say and try to take territory from Russia, first it will have to resolve all the issues that constitute, in their view, the core of the Chinese statehood.
So, your question?
Well, you said that for now, Russia and China do not confront each other regarding their national interest. But what about China's growing presence in Russia and near abroad, namely in Central Asia, where China stands as a larger and larger partner for Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where Russia has deep interest? Thank you.
Right. Well, I said for now, but you're right. I mean, there are tensions. And even the formula where the arrangement is where Russia provides security and China provides investment, no longer holds water. If you notice, there was an article in Wall Street Journal a few days ago in which it said that China outfitted over 40 border guard posts on the border of Tajikistan with Afghanistan. But moreover, according to Wall Street Journal, it is manned by Chinese border guards. So suddenly, there's Chinese military presence in Central Asia. So in that sense, yes, I mean the future holds tensions. For now, they're being managed, okay, and Russia benefits in a sense from Chinese investment into Central Asia because that helps to prop up the governments. And Russia is interested in keeping those governments in place because they are pro-Russian, but also if they fail, who knows what kind of Islamists can come to power. There could be, it might be as well be democratic secular opposition that would take over, but it might be that it will be like Islamic State allied faction that takes over. So for now, Russia is managing and tolerating, in my view, Chinese expanding presence. But in future, let me see, go back. Maybe I didn't include it in the slide. But in future, yes, there will be tensions, and those tensions could lead to a situation might become negative. Yeah. So that's what I meant when I wrote that. Thank you.
If you agree, we can take 3 to 4 more questions. Or
yeah, I just prefer two at once or each separately because otherwise I
So 2 questions.
Mr. McKinsey, advisor to French industry. 2 or 3 points. With regard to the unlikely military alliance, may we say, to fine-tune the issue, that as long as the threat stays rather coldish between the United States and China, Russia and China will not build an alliance. They may assist each other with various low-profile gestures rather than showing strong military commitment. 1 point. Second point, what do you think of the recent evolution of the Belt and Road Initiative cooperation between Russia and China, which up to very recently was not very high due to the weakness of the Euro-Asiatic organization, which was very weak. And now we see very recently an improvement of Chinese and Russian cooperation. There had been a huge Chinese delegation recently, and it showed that both parties have somewhat changed their position, leading to more cooperation rather than competition only.
So,
well, thank you very much for Isabelle, University Sorbonne Nouvelle. Thank you very much for trying to frame, conceptualize what is taking place. I was wondering about 2 countries especially. One which would have negative effects on such an rapprochement, which is another term I could throw in here, and one where this rapprochement is definitely taking place. My first question is about India and Pakistan. That is, one country, Russia, as you were pointing out, has a strategic partnership with India, when, if I'm not wrong, China has one with Pakistan on the other side. This is most definitely, historically, etc., irreconcilable. So how could we see an alliance if we enlarge a little bit this bilateral, whatever it is, to try and make it minilateral, potentially multipolar is where I'm thinking. Okay, India and Pakistan would be in the way most likely. And on the other side of the coin, I was wondering as to this sort of attempt by Russia to woo Turkey militarily towards, Turkey, NATO member, militarily towards Russia at the same time as China has been investing more and more in Turkey. And in this case, do you think we have something of a strategic alliance this time, which might be aiming, come what may, to try and, I don't dare to finish my sentence, but detach Turkey from NATO eventually?
Okay. So, to answer the first question, I'm sorry, but I didn't quite understand both questions. So, about the belt.
The first question, I agree with you. There is no genuine alliance.
Okay.
But there there may be very strong cooperation between China and Russia as long as hostility from the US
Yes.
is not hot.
Yes, I agree.
So the second point, the recent evolution of the Chinese-Russia cooperation within the frame of Belt and Road has shown
Belt Road,
a
okay.
very huge recent improvement in contrast with the weakness of the Euro-Asiatic organization.
Okay, Eurasian you mean? Eurasian. Okay, I didn't understand that part. Okay, so yes, I agree with your first proposition. And second, Russia had been guarded in its attitude towards that project because it didn't quite see how it could manage to expand its own economic cloud in countries of post-Soviet neighborhood through the Eurasian Union, while China has much more resources. So it kept sort of delaying what eventually turned out to be inevitable. So Putin eventually said, yes, we're going to cooperate. And I think in part is that because there's no really much choice, yes. I mean, if you have enormous financial resources and you're looking ways to invest, what can Russia do to prevent that from happening? So choosing between the two evils, choose the less evil and see whether you can profit from that. And that's what accounted for the turnaround, not turnaround, but transition from sort of a silence on the issue and sort of a signaling, tacit signal that it's not quite in our interest to sort of endorsing the project, albeit reluctantly. So then in terms of India and Pakistan, again, if both countries see an overriding threat to their national security, they would be thinking egoistically about themselves rather than their allies or clients, how you describe them. So I would say that Russia and China, if US and its allies come to pose a credible threat, military or threat of, what Professor Yan described as sovereignty, to China's key interest in ensuring its sovereignty, then they would ally regardless. But also, there might be ways in future to work through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which Russia has already brought India into, to sort of mitigate the impact. I don't know. Who knows what the future holds. In terms of the relationship of the effort to detach Turkey, I think, it's like you have 100 pennies. How do you spend them? How many of these pennies are you going to spend on trying to detach Turkey from NATO? Would Russia benefit from that? Vladimir Putin's Russia, which sees NATO as a number one source of military dangers, risks. Yes, but would Russia spend a lot of resources and time to actually do that? Well, probably difficult to say. I would say it won't be a priority because for Russia's priorities are its minimum security requirements in the European theater, which is not expansion of NATO, rather than in the European theater, not shrinking of NATO in that particular theater, which is more sort of facing the Middle East. So I would say you are right to assess that Russia would be interested. Vladimir Putin's Russia would be interested in that, and you are right that maybe China could play some role in that. But I don't think this is going to be a priority, foreign policy priority, unless and until the issue of European security is resolved in ways that Russia could live with, which is, non-expansion of NATO further into post-Soviet neighborhood.
last questions, if there are any. One here and one here.
Thank you. You really point something I think it's important, is China is moving toward 2045 for the reunion of the secessionist part of Taiwan to the main countries. So it's becoming the key point of the foreign policy of China, even in Africa. The retaliation of Taiwan is the key point everywhere China goes. So is Russia going to help China in a kind of invasion or something like this of Taiwan? And what will be, in your point of view, the kind of... I'm losing my English, but you understand. How do Russia will react whatever China will do toward Taiwan? Thank you.
You mentioned military-to-military relation between China and Russia, namely the Vostok 2008 joint exercise. It was a Chinese delegation that was quite large in terms of quantity of men present there, but in terms of operational capabilities, it was very low profile. It was mostly they watch and sit. So I wonder, do you think that the low level of military interaction between Russia and China for now is due to Moscow's reluctance to diffuse strategic capabilities that Beijing lack for now? And because I think for now the main reasons why China is still smaller than the US in the short term is that China lacked the very in-depth operational capabilities of a modern armed force.
Okay, so Russia is not going to invade Taiwan with China. I don't see it happening in any scenario. I mean, what you could see is Russia rendering diplomatic support at the United Nations Security Council by, say, vetoing a resolution. But the scenario you describe is very explosive. I mean, it could lead to a World War III. So I don't see China invading Taiwan either, with U.S. hovering over that particular theater.
You are sure the United States will react?
Sorry?
You are sure the United States will react if Taiwan is invaded by Peking?
I think it's if it's a great, among other things, source of leverage. Okay, so as long as China is focused on Taiwan, it's not focused on other things. So keeping Taiwan as that kind of leverage is in the interest of those who do not want to manage China's rise, to put it diplomatically. So the second question was about Vostok. That was more of a symbolic significance. Why? Because Vostok, like Zapad and other annual exercises that Russian military hold, used to be strictly domestic affair plus Belarus, because there's a union state being built. So this was for the first time that China was given a signal that we are no longer training in Vostok exercises, in the East exercises, against you. Because I didn't have time to address it, but if you look at statements by Russian military commanders, like Chief of General Staff at the time, Makarov, or Chief of the Ground Forces, they implied that they are planning for a war with China too, in their statements, explicitly. So from that you can deduce that when Russia holds the annual East exercise, especially if it's the biggest exercise, because they rotate from 4 directions, then it's a signal to China too. But by inviting Chinese, you are telling them that we are no longer training, in these exercises to fight a war with you. And that's a major sort of major step by Russia in fostering further relationship. I agree that China is not on par, of course, And if you read Professor Jan's list of interests, one is to build a modern military that is capable of doing what other countries do, which China doesn't mean, but calls them, we oppose hegemony. So Russia's military doctrine names US, NATO, China's white paper says hegemon. So I think China will continue to move in that direction, but how fast it can catch up, and can US pull off another military revolution that is being actively discussed to again widen the gap, which has been narrowed? I don't know. I mean, I just don't have a crystal ball to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you. Thank you.